Hello students, welcome back to our series of videos for Chapter 5, different trade theories. So, mercantilism. This is an economic approach or philosophy. Basically advocates that countries should basically only export. So the major flaw with this approach is that it views trade as a zero-sum game. We talked about that earlier, where I win, you lose, you win, I lose kind of thing. So that's why it's a zero-sum game. This was the prevailing approach prior to Adam Smith when he argued against it. So basically in this approach, there's some major flaws with this one. One of them is that it causes inflation. So if, say, you have an example or a situation where one country is only exporting, the other country can only be importing. So the more you export, the more money you're going to make. And there's going to be an increase of flow of money, whether it's gold or currency, into your nation. And that alone is going to cause significant price inflation. So this philosophy was used by Europeans, and basically it fueled colonialism in Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and Spain. Those countries basically refused to import from each other. They all wanted to export. Of course, you can't have a situation where everyone exports, because one person's exports is another person's imports. So it's flawed. So these countries needed different and additional sources of products and raw materials. So that's when they went out in their colonial pursuits. As the economic philosophy, the mercantilism is flawed, yet many political views today have the goal, or many politicians have the goal of boosting exports while limiting imports. If of course, if every nation did that, there would be no trade. Most politicians today want to do some element of this theory. Trump, for example, at the start of his presidency 4 years ago, he vowed to review the nation's trade deals to ensure that Americans were winning. And that's just, you can't win in every trade deal. The current trade theories state that trading is a win-win situation. The more we trade internationally, the better and healthier the global economy is. We're going to look on in later chapters why, in some situations, why governments try to restrict trade. But remembering in this chapter, we're looking at the benefits of trade. So, absolute advantage, Adam Smith. He wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations. But we talked briefly about the absolute advantage earlier. And we can see that in this slide that they gave to us, an example of, really basic example of the benefit of absolute advantage and the gains that we can make from trade. So there's two countries, Ghana and South Korea. They're producing two products, cocoa and rice. And we can see that Ghana has the advantage in producing cocoa. It takes less tons or less resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa. South Korea takes less resources to produce ton of rice. So at the bottom of this gives us the benefit, the increase in consumption as a result of specialization in trade. Basically, for cocoa, there's 7.5 extra units or tons of production, 4 and 3.5, and with rice there's an extra 5, one from Ghana and 4 from South Korea. Basically, those two nations are better off because of trade. Comparative advantage, David Ricardo. This is the opportunity cost. We briefly talked about this as well. It's a situation in which a country specializes in producing the goods it produces most efficiently and buys the products it produces less efficiently from other countries. So this theory is based on differences in productivity between nations. Opportunity cost is important in understanding this theory. There are some limitations to the absolute and comparative advantage. One of the limitations is that it assumes a constant return to scale. So every resource you add or you take away from producing one product, you then start use that resource to produce something else, you are assuming a constant return to scale. And the example earlier about Ghana and South Korea is if, say, South Korea were to then stop producing cocoa and want to produce rice, well, that land that they're going to take out of cocoa production into rice production may not be better or may not be best suited for the production of rice. So that is one of the flaws. There's other assumptions too. There's only two countries, two goods, zero transportation costs, similar prices and values, and resources are mobile between goods within the countries, but not across the countries. It does assume a constant return to scale and has no effect on, and that it has no effect on income distribution within countries, which it does. As a country is better off, you may get immigration, so your stock of resources is going to increase. Immobile resources, as we said, that's one of the key flaws. We're assuming that farmers could convert land from growing cocoa to rice easily. Same in other situations where you might change the workforce from textile to software engineers. You just can't do that. Diminishing returns, it does assume a constant return to specialization. Every acre of land converted will yield the same return, which it won't. So there are some flaws. However, it does prove or show, and evidence has shown this, that comparative and absolute advantage, there are gains in specializing in the production of either good or service for nations and trading for what you are not as efficient at. Heckscher-Ohlin theory. As it says there, predicting that countries will export those goods that make intensive use of factors that are locally abundant, while importing goods that make intensive use of factors that are locally scarce. So your basic factors: natural resources, climate, geographic location, demographics. If a country has no basic factors, it must invest in advanced factors. Capital investment by people, companies, and the government, for example, would be some advanced factors. So the pattern of trade is determined by national factor endowments. And they would predict that countries will export goods that make intensive use of locally abundant factors. So you have a lot of locally abundant factors, you're going to produce those factors and export. And you will import goods that the factors are locally scarce. You can't produce those products. Wassily Leontief, 1953, he theorized that since the U.S. was relatively abundant in capital compared to other nations, the U.S. would be an exporter of capital-intensive goods and an importer of labor-intensive goods, as per the Heckscher-Ohlin theory. However, he found that the U.S. exports were less capital-intensive than the U.S. imports. So that basically resulted. That result was at variance with the predictions of Heckscher-Ohlin theory. So it became known as the Leontief paradox, the Wassily Leontief paradox. There's possible explanations as to why there is that paradox, given that the Heckscher-Ohlin theory does hold out. It has been supported by more research than Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, and it does make fewer assumptions. So it's an easier theory to grasp, and it's being more studied with positive results. So as I said, one possible explanation just from your textbook is that the US has a special advantage in producing new products made with innovative technologies. Those products may be less capital intensive than products whose technology has had time to mature and become suitable for mass production. The US may be exporting goods that use skilled labor and innovative entrepreneurship, like computer software, while importing heavy manufacturing products that use large amounts of capital. So the theory holds, even with that paradox, because of some of the current research into that. Vernon, the Raymond Vernon theory of product life cycle. This is an interesting theory. It has been studied quite a bit, and there's lots of evidence to support this. He went on to argue that early in the life cycle of a typical new product, while demand is starting to grow rapidly in the United States, demand in other advanced countries is limited to high-income groups, generally with the assumption, the early belief that the United States, the consumers, have more wealth, more purchasing power, and more a greater ability and desire in some ways to incur debt. So they spend a lot of money. So that's why this theory would state that there's a lot of new product development in the US. So this theory would state that products are developed in the US because of their innovation and their wealth. As a product moved along its product life cycle and matured to the point where the product had saturated the US market, US producers realized that if it wanted to keep selling the product, they had to do it cheaper. And in order to capitalize on other markets, either undeveloped or developing markets, basically had to make a decision of, should we move there if we want to stay in business? The new product, or the product life cycle theory, basically states that as the products mature, both the location of sales and the optimal production location will change, which affects the flow and direction of trade, proposed by Ray Vernon in the 1960s. At the time of his theories, new products were developed in the US and sold first in the US. So, according to the product life cycle theory, the size and wealth of the US market gave those firms a strong incentive to develop new products, initially produced and sold in the US. And as demand grew, US firms began to export. The market saturated in the US, which caused the company, as I said, to look for different locations. This theory is very ethnocentric. Most examples under this theory are viewed from the US perspective. The global disbursement from say 1945 to 1975, most products were first introduced in the US, but that doesn't happen today. So this theory has lost some value to a degree. Many new products, technology especially, are first introduced in Japan and South Korea, and later on in the US and western parts of the world. So this theory has some merit, but it was very US centered. We'll go on to the new trade theory. We'll discuss the new trade theory in the next video.